so we will be fine on the recording front. Okay.
No, thanks.
Okay, now how do I do this? That's probably not very readable from the end, is it? Probably not. In theory, there is a way I can make this larger, but that relies on me having technical skills that I don't really have.
They've changed it all since I know it. Christian knows how to do it. I watched him do it, but he was too quick. He was too quick for me.
Oh, full screen. Oh.
Oh, there you go.
Woo. Okay.
There's usually a way you can share your screen, but that's the way Christian does it.
Right.
I can do it.
We'll hope for the best on that one.
Bounce on him.
Sorry, Robin, if you try Control Plus, I'm not sure that might.
Right. Control Plus. Ooh, it definitely did something.
Yeah, it's probably because it's in presenter mode though.
Just keep your finger on Control Plus.
Yeah. Maybe rest the mug on it.
Okay, right. Well, we'll hope for the best. So, just the basic housekeeping stuff. We will aim to finish at 12. I know I'm a bit crap at timekeeping, and it might go over a little bit, but I do have other stuff to go in other classes this afternoon, so I've definitely got to finish in time for those. So as close to 12 as we can humanly make it. I'll sort of guide through some ideas, but do please chip in experiences, views, concepts, try and make it a bit of a dynamic engagement. The idea behind this session is to look at some ethical theories and philosophies that underpin the notion of what people variously call either cancel culture if they don't like it, or consequence culture if they do like it and they think it's a wonderful idea. So it's basically the same thing perceived from positive or negative points of view. So we'll sort of explore arguments both for and against, and I'll try and remain as neutral as I can be. And some of you might think you like the idea of consequence culture, and some of you might think it's a terrible thing and it's all cancel culture and should be itself cancelled. But we can kind of explore your own views and experiences as we go along, and we'll do our best not to cancel each other as we go. Is anyone wanting more windows open, or is it too hot, too cold?
Can I open that one? Would that be difficult, or would it?
No, they should all, in theory, open easily.
Do you mind? Tell me if you want to close.
Yes.
Okay. So, in a nutshell, what is it? What are we talking about? The focus of today is cyber ethics, so the ethics of online behaviour and activity. But we can make the argument that cancel culture under other names has gone back probably to the Stone Age, in that we've always had the capacity to ostracise people we don't like. Communities come together, they point the finger and say, "Thou art wicked," for any one of 1,000 different reasons, and that person is driven out the village, stoned to death, lynched, set light to something unpleasant happens to them because they have done something or said something or are suspected of behaving in a certain way that the rest of the community disapproves of. It would be easy to take a very kind of liberal view and assume that the people doing the finger pointing are always knuckle dragging halfwits, making unpleasant and unfounded accusations. On the other hand, people genuinely do pretty foul, unpleasant things, and if they're found out, maybe we could make the argument that ostracizing them, dealing with them, is something that communities have to do. Can you have someone in your midst who is a serial sex offender or a cannibal or engages in some other deeply antisocial activity? Do you just have to tut at them a bit and hope they stop? Or do you take stronger measures to try and put an end to what they're doing, whether that is stringing them up from the nearest tree or whether it's exiling them and making them into somebody else's problem somewhere else, so that some other village then has to deal with what they get up to when they arrive there. Different communities have taken different approaches at various points in history. So in early medieval Ireland, one of the standard practices in cases of murder, particularly where someone had murdered one of their own relatives, and I dare say we've all had that temptation at some point or another, and at least giving it passing thought, if nothing else. If you murdered a stranger, the expectation was that you would pay a fine to the family of the person you had murdered, and the fine would be proportionate to the earning power of the murder victim. If it was one of your own relatives, you cannot pay a fine to yourself, because in effect, you are one of the grieving relatives. Probably not grieving that much if you killed them, but you are one of the grieving relatives that would receive the money. So the standard punishment there for people who were perceived as kind of beyond the pale was to put them in a tiny boat, a coracle, which some of you may have I've made a coracle. It's one of the most disgusting experiences of my life, scraping fat off the inside of a dead sheep in order to make a sheepskin boat. But they are tiny. They're not much bigger than one of these tables. You can just about fit one small person in if you fold them up a bit and stuff them in a coracle. Put them in one of those with no oar and push them out to sea, with the idea that from a Christian point of view, God, and from the earlier pagan point of view, the gods in plural, would determine what happened to that person, whether they'd be swept so far out to sea they'd just drown, or whether they'd be swept 5 miles down the coast and wash up in somebody else's territory and be somebody else's problem. So it's a form of extreme ostracism with the potential of death happening. But obviously it's kind of clearly pre-internet land. Flash forward a couple of thousand years to where we are today. When we're talking cancel culture, consequence culture, whatever you want to call it, it's the idea that someone has said something or done something which at least one other person who is online finds objectionable. And so they, either as an isolated voice or they gather together with their friends and other people of similar points of view, denounce that person for whatever it is that they've said or they've done. Sometimes it may be a genuinely objectionable thing that person has said or done. You know, the kind of the Jimmy Saviles of the world who really have done something quite foul and beyond acceptability. Other times it doesn't seem to require very much of anything to get cancelled. There's an example of a Canadian singer who was very kind of counterculture and popular until somebody noticed that she had clicked like on a post on somebody else's Facebook page. And because they didn't like that Facebook posting and she had clicked like, that meant she must support this other person. It was a joke about bullying. So it was deemed that the singer was therefore in favour of bullying because she'd clicked like, and as a result she was bullied off of social media, which is ironic. So something as simple as clicking a button can be enough to get you cancelled, denounced by the foregathered members of the internet. Now clearly it's not everyone. The vast majority, the billions of people use the net, and the vast majority of them do not participate in any given act of cancellation. But it works more effectively as a form of denouncement if there is more than one person doing the denouncing. If it's just you going, oh, you're awful, you are, who's going to pay attention to one person? Probably not very many people at all. But if it's 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 1,000,000 people, all saying this individual is terrible and wicked and they've done this some dreadful thing, they must be cancelled. Then it starts to take its effect as a technique. It becomes like half the village turning up to point at the supposed witch. It becomes a method of gaining momentum, gaining sufficient clout. Now, what's not clear when we look at, and this is the kind of the online version of this, is such a recent thing that the research is still very minimal. Lots of areas for exploration and additional research. How many people does it take to make an effective mob? You know, in a village, let's say you've got a village of 200 people, how many of them do you need for a good old witch burning to actually be an effective mob, so that the rest of the village either join in or hide under the bed and wait for it to go away? but do nothing to protect the person being denounced. I'm not expecting a clear answer on that. How many does it take? And equally, you could say, how many people online, how many people have to sign a petition for the government to give a flying donut about whatever the petition is about? In theory, there are certain numbers if you want to get an issue debated in Parliament. I think it's about 100,000 at the moment, where you have to have a certain number of signatures, and then, so long as it's not calling for a vote of no confidence in the current Prime Minister, because you can have 1 million signatures on that and they'll still ignore it. But no matter who the Prime Minister is, it will just kind of be swept under the carpet. But for other issues, so I think the law about stealing pets should be changed. And if 100,000 people sign a petition, that won't guarantee it gets through, but it will get it debated. So there is a number which is considered sufficient to pay attention to. What we don't have with the kind of online denouncements is a regulation of numbers. So if a lot of people get together and say, we can't stand that actor, that singer, that author, they've said this, done that, we can't stand them, we think they should be cancelled. How many people have to say that for the publishing company or the actor's agent or the hiring film directors who might be employing that actor or singer or whoever it is? At what point do they go, fair enough, there's enough of you saying this that I will no longer engage that person?
It's very little, isn't it? Because of the lecturers that have been.
It doesn't seem to take an awful lot.
No.
Surely it depends on the individuals doing it as well. If they are higher up in the village, if they were the village leader, then
Yes.
they're going to carry much more weight.
Absolutely. The mad person at the end of the village, indeed, who's probably the one getting the finger pointed at them half the time. When celebrities get involved in denouncing some other celebrity, as is happening, we'll look at a case momentarily, happening as we speak in America. There's a bit of kind of cancellation going on. That tends, because of the celebrity status, to add some degree of weight. There is the argument that, particularly with the case at the moment,
Somebody for
oh, lovely, hello. That's good.
If you go that way, close the door and then you can go through.
We've got an extra chair just at that end. Some of the, thinking particularly of the case at the moment, which involves Netflix, some of the celebrities getting involved in denouncing the individual are probably at best Z-list. They're very, very minor celebrities. But maybe as a result of getting their face in the paper and being interviewed, their kudos, their earning power, their employability will go up. And so there is an advantage to being in a denouncing mob. Partly you may genuinely feel that what that person has said is unacceptable, which is fair enough. But also some people may have an eye to the, how can I improve my publicity, my status, especially if they themselves are someone who is employed in the media arena. There is an advantage for them being seen to be in the mob. So that there's these sort of other underlying rather unpleasant issues that play out for some people. Now, Foster has made the argument, and he's not the only person to make this argument, that a lot of the phenomena you can witness going on social media has more than a whiff of religion about it, and not necessarily a whiff of the nice bits of religion. It's more a whiff of the bits of religion that most of us perhaps wish would fade away a little bit. The notion of moral purity. Most religions encourage their devotees to become better people, nicer people, kinder people, etc., to be morally upstanding. Now, at one level, if it's just let's all hug more puppies and help people across the road, that's fine and good. But if that moral purge, that desire for moral purity becomes a purge, let's get rid of the wicked. Instead of let's educate the wicked to make them better people, let's just get rid of the wicked. That kind of mania, which you can see kicking in many, many, many religions around the world over the course of human history, starts to manifest itself on social media around, not so much around religious issues, but around political issues. So as if politics becomes the new religion for a lot of people. It has the same fervor, the same passion, the same righteous zeal that you have, this person over here has said something which is blasphemous. The word isn't used, but the implication behind it is that what you have said is blasphemy and must be denounced. You're a sinner, you're a wicked person, you hold the wrong belief. Therefore, we must all gather together and wag our fingers at you collectively and tut a lot and express our disapproval. Where this goes beyond people tutting at each other, which people have been doing since tutting was invented millions of years ago, is quite what we mean by either cancellation or consequence. What does that involve? Is it just a case of disapproving of something, saying, I don't like what you said, I think that was unpleasant? Or does it go beyond that? And increasingly it is going beyond that, and that's where it becomes a matter of concern for a lot of people. If it was just at the level of disapproval, it wouldn't be a massive thing. It would be just normal human interaction. We're forever saying things that somebody somewhere will not approve of. So that there's nothing particularly remarkable in that. It's when someone is expected to suffer in some way that it becomes an issue, and it's perceived to be the duty of those gathered within the mob to ensure that suffering happens. Now, the suffering can be financial. Let's get that person out of a job. This famous actor should not be employed in films anymore. That author should be ditched by their publishing company. This lecturer at a university should be sacked and not allowed to teach anymore. That doctor should not be allowed to practice anymore. They've done something, and the foregathered forces of the internet, or however many people happen to be within that particular mob. I'm trying to think of a more neutral word than mob, but sounds vaguely pejorative, doesn't it? Gang. In that gang, that's even better, is it really? They want that person out of a job, so that's got to be part of the punishment. However, it's gone beyond that. There are cases where individuals have said and done things, and sometimes it is quite genuinely unpleasant things that they have said and done. So a case in point of that is the Charlottesville Marches that took place a few years ago in America, in Charlottesville, when a lot of people who appear to have had very, very, shall we say, quite hard right points of view, some of them full-on Ku Klux Klan, others not quite that extreme, but still, more, what I suppose we would call quite conservative, or by Republican standards, quite Republican in America, were on a parade through Charlottesville to defend a statue of a Civil War general from being taken down, back when taking down statues was quite a popular thing to do in America, still is in some places. So there was this sort of defend the statue march. Because some of them were clearly displaying flags and banners which were Ku Klux Klan flags and other extremist groups like Stormfront and things like that, very, very, very kind of neo-Nazi style groups in America. There was a campaign to identify the people whose photographs appeared on the TV news and in the newspapers. And so people were going on me to say, oh, I know him, he lives 3 doors down the road from me. Or I know her, she works at the shop around the corner. Putting a name to people, and then people online would, the term is doxing. A lot of you may be familiar with it, but if you're not, it's finding out the private details of somebody, their home address, where they work, who their relatives are, and then putting it out online so that anyone going on the website can find out where Joe Bloggs lives, where he works, who his wife is, who his kids are, etc., etc. And then leaving the information there and effectively saying, if anything happens, it's not my fault. So if a brick goes through Joe Bloggs' window, or a petrol bomb, well, it's not my fault, I didn't throw it. I just put their name and address and bank details and inside leg measurement online for the world to see.
That's called
Doxing. It comes from document, to put their documents online to dox them. So that happened. Quite a lot of these people on the march had their places of employment, their home addresses, etc., put online. A lot of them lost their jobs. Some of them got kicked out. The younger ones got kicked out of university courses because it was deemed that they could no longer be, if that university allowed them to stay in their studies, somehow the university would be condoning their points of view, and they couldn't be seen to do that in public. Some people had their wives, their children, their husbands, their family contacted with emails and phone calls and so on, saying, do you know what your Uncle Fred was doing last Thursday afternoon. And that gets quite, as I'm sure you can imagine, if you out of the blue, you suddenly had 50 phone calls a day from random strangers demanding to know what you're going to do about your third cousin twice removed. That gets a little bit creepy, to put it mildly, and highly intrusive. So even though the march was a quite objectionable march, particularly those who were flying these flags and banners, more so maybe than the other ones, one of the issues of concern is how far do people go in pursuit of what they regard as justice. So they say, I don't like your point of view. I don't think you should be in the Ku Klux Klan. I don't think you should be getting all het up about a statue. I want to do something about you. Even though I've never met you, possibly don't even live in the same country as you, because obviously the nature of the internet, you can harangue people who live 5,000 miles away from you quite easily, if you are so inclined. I want to do something about this random stranger whom 3 minutes earlier I'd never even knew existed, but now I've seen their face in the news, in the paper, online. I'm going to do something about them. And at one level you can say, fair enough, you don't like their politics. No reason why you should like their politics. Maybe you want to make your disapproval of their politics known. But when does it become too much? When does it become threatening, menacing? Are we going to say that people of certain political points of view should never be allowed to work again? In which case they're going to become dependents on the state, surely. And then we're going to sit there and moan about them receiving state benefits. How far are we going to carry this? There have been cases of people who've ended up committing suicide, not from that particular Charlottesville event, but other events where people have committed suicide because they've been so harangued, they've lost jobs, they've become estranged from their families. All sorts of problems have happened, and maybe it's not wholly down to internet campaigns. Other issues may be going on in their life, but clearly the internet campaign hasn't helped, hasn't done them any favours, and it may be the factor that pushed them over the edge and led them to being on a bridge somewhere and jumping off it or putting a gun to their head or whatever they've done. And that kind of mania is something that Foster is picking up on, that it's zealotry. It's not just, I don't like your politics. It has the zealous quality of the Inquisitions and the purges of the Middle Ages and earlier, where whole villages of people who were of the wrong religion were being slaughtered as an act of purification. And it's, whilst we haven't quite got to the point of burning down entire villages worth of people, the mania to target individuals and not know when to stop is something of concern to an increasing number of people. The people who would describe this as cancel culture rather than consequence culture. Those who are more in favour of it might make the argument, well, if somebody has crappy points of view, they deserve to have some consequences for that. And the consequences might be losing your job. It might be becoming estranged from a family member. It might be getting shouted at in the street, or getting 1,000 emails a day telling you what a piece of scumbag you are. What is an appropriate response? For some people, you kind of get the feeling that nothing would ever be quite enough until that person has ceased to exist. Even if that person then turns around and says, oh, I was wrong when I said such and such a thing, I repent, I recant. And it does have that kind of air of religious repentance. I have seen the light, I now agree with your one true point of view, whatever that may be. Sometimes even that's not enough to get them off the hook. And they still go on being harangued and harangued and harangued. And it's not so much the issue of objecting to people's points of view, but the issue of how unregulated that objection becomes on the internet, which isn't to say it was necessarily very well regulated 1,000 years ago when villages were turning on the unbeliever in the village, but that becomes an issue. There's just 4 random people who have been on the receiving end, well-known people, I'm not sure if Tim Hunt is well-known, but reasonably well-known people who've been on the receiving end of cancel culture, consequence culture, whatever you want to call it, as examples. We won't go into their cases in massive amounts of detail. J.K. Rowling's, I'm assuming everyone knows Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling. It's not anyone who's been living in a cupboard who's got no idea who she is. Her most recent offences within the last few years have been around the issues of who or what is defined as a woman and what terms are used to describe women or people who identify as women and so on. She is now being labelled, and I think at some point she has said, I don't mind the label, or words to that general effect, as a TERF, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. If anyone's thinking, well, what's that then?
That's another lecture.
It is. It's a whole thing in itself. The kind of feminism that was very prominent in the 1970s, and you've still got people like Germaine Greer and so on who are holders of that set of values, made the argument that if you are biologically female or biologically male, you have experiences in life and in your body and so on, which are unique to you. So someone who's biologically male will never know quite what it's like to be a woman, and vice versa. So for them, gender, sex, and biology are one and the same thing. With the increase of medical technologies that enable more people to have hormonal injections and operations and so forth, who maybe were born in as one sex but now identify as another, there is a push from third and fourth wave feminism. We're arguably on the edge of fifth wave feminism at the moment, just to complicate the picture. you blink twice and you missed it, and there's a fifth one there. That is more accommodating to this idea that a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. So both those who are biologically female, but also people who could have a beard and male bits and say, as of today, I would like to be known as a woman, and please call me Sheila. So would not necessarily have to have surgery or injections or anything. I could be completely physically male, but identify as a woman. And for a lot of third, fourth wave feminists, that would be sufficient to say I am now a woman and must be referred to as such and included as such. Whereas Rowling's is not quite in the same camp as Germaine Greer, but slightly more in that direction, in that she's going down more the biological route. I imagine probably several billion people on the planet would agree with her, I expect. The vast majority of human history has viewed gender as essentially a biological thing more than anything else. It's hardly a shock, horror, gasp point of view. At least it wasn't until quite recently. Now it's become a matter of controversy. Gina Carano is possibly not quite as well known. Well, possibly, definitely not quite as well known. She's an American actress who has also said similar things to J.K. Rowling around the issues of gender and who's a woman and who's a man and so on. Both of them have been on the receiving end of campaigns to get them, in Gina Carano's case, fired from the TV show she was working on at the time, and the directors or producers, whoever it is that makes these decisions, did indeed try and drop her. And there was a big outcry from her fans who said, no, keep her on board, and it led to this sort of rift. The attempts to cancel J.K. Rowling's have fallen flat. And it has been pointed out, if you're as rich as she is, you can do as you damn well please. No one has the power, short of actually putting a bullet through you, no one has the power to do anything that would dent her wealth, dent her fame, dent the number of people who love her books, and so on. Although there have been people going, recording themselves and TikToking it, recording themselves burning her books, which, if we're going back to this kind of religious imagery and, the Inquisition lobbing the books of the heretics on the bonfires of the vanities. So let's all go and set light to Harry Potter and make a protest about something, which seems a little bit unfortunate. It begs a whole bunch of other questions, which a few years ago we had a seminar around the ethics of art. And this whole question was not her J.K. Rowling's, but the question of whether you can separate the artist from the art ethically. So you could thoroughly dislike the artist, but really like their art, or music, or paintings, or books, or whatever. Whereas for other people, if they don't like the one, they won't, or will decide they will cease to enjoy the other. To a point, I can understand it if we're thinking somebody like Gary Glitter. It's quite hard, even if you used to like his music, it's quite hard now to listen to it without thinking about certain aspects of his life, let's put it like that. So sometimes there are things that are done and it's is quite difficult to then appreciate someone's creative acts without thinking of the other things they've been getting up to. But if we were to censor every single artist and author and musician who's had a dodgy life, who would be left? Artists are not employed because of their moral purity, let's face it. Whatever type of art they're creating, they're often quite, shall we say, colourful characters in terms of their private lives and viewpoints and so on. But that's a whole other issue in itself. Tim Hunt, Sir Tim Hunt, we should say, still is a leading scientist who was giving a after-dinner speech at a gathering of fellow scientists and made a rather 1970s type sexist joke about pretty lab assistants and how distracting they were. And somebody at the dinner videoed him saying it, which is also something quite typical about modern life, that, oh, look, someone's saying something, let me get my phone out and record it. And then within a split second, it was up online and 50 million people had seen it and shared it. And random strangers all over the world who'd probably never heard of Tim Hunt 3 seconds before seeing the video were then bombarding his university saying, look at this disgusting old man with his outdated points of view, he should be fired. Within about 2 days, he'd resigned from not only his job as the head of the institute, but he held quite a lot of honorary positions, and he felt obliged, despite a lifetime of doing quite decent scientific research and being, presumably, I've never met him, but I presume he's probably just quite a nice, ordinary sort of chap. Old-fashioned views, but then again, he's not exactly a spring chicken, so his views are of an era he grew up in. I know people do change sometimes, but he was hounded for jokes. Dave Chappelle is the current figure of Roth. I mentioned Netflix earlier. He again is to do with the transgender. This isn't always to do with transgender. It's just in these particular cases happen to be. He's made some very, for lack of a better word, colourful jokes, let's put it like, on a comedy routine that was televised on the Netflix channel. He is famous for very, very, very near-the-knuckle comedy on all sorts of issues, racial issues, sex, gender. He's just not exactly Bernard Manning, he's not quite that bad, but he is known for his kind of shocking humour. That's why he gets paid millions and millions and millions. And he's made, in his latest TV program, some reasonably dodgy jokes. They're quite edgy, I suppose. And some people found them hysterically funny. Some people found them really offensive. We are in the territory of people also being offended on behalf of other people. So it's not only people saying, I personally am a transgender person, that really upset me, that joke. It's also other people saying, I'm not transgender, but I am going to be offended on behalf of people who are. And a lot of cases of cancellation or consequence are often people who are not directly affected by the issue, saying, nonetheless, I am offended on behalf of so-and-so people, and I feel obliged to do something on their behalf. So it raises these kinds of secondary issues around who can object to what. Anyone can object to anything, but at what point does it stop making sense if you get irate on behalf of somebody else, particularly if the somebody else isn't necessarily irate? It's certainly an experience I've had of people saying jokes have been made and I found them funny, but other people have gone, oh my God, that's so offensive. I laughed. What's the big deal? Who is the arbiter of whether something is funny or not? The person about whom the joke is made, or people around them? And even then, if you've got a joke, he does a lot of jokes about black people. Let's say he's got 1,000 black people in the audience, 950 of them laugh, and another 50 get offended. Does that make the joke offensive? Or do we do it on a kind of a ratio? If more people laugh than don't, it's okay?
I think comedy is one of the hardest things.
It is.
Because it's not an opinion, is it? It's
No.
cheap crap to get on. That's what bothers me about it, really. I know I'll let them have one for speech, but I just think comedy is something in itself. Should you really say that in an argument? I don't know.
It is probably one of the most awkward areas of creativity. I suppose to an extent you could say with anything, what's beautiful is in the eye of the beholder, what's funny is in the eye of the beholder. But what will reduce one person to hysterics might reduce somebody else to tears.
Yeah.
And it is a bit of a difficult one to tread when it comes to the sort of the morality of humour, or ethics of humour, however you want to phrase it. Again, the argument has been made that rather like Rowling's, he is a very, 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 very rich man, and he can probably shrug it all off. And even if he gets dropped from Netflix, he's not exactly going to be on the dole queue anytime soon. So, will it really affect him? The latest turn is that 1,000-odd employees of Netflix have threatened to walk out of their jobs if the managers of the company do not drop him as their comedy act and stop airing his programs. Whether they will or not, who knows?
But then surely people know what he's like. I mean, there is the off button. I mean,
yes, it's a bit like going to a...
So Piers Morgan, though, isn't it? He's on the line. Some people like him, some people hate him.
so you
Yeah,
wouldn't
watch
watch
it.
him, would you?
Yeah,
if you
Well,
don't
no.
want, if you know he's going to upset you, why would you watch him?
They've been going to Quentin Tarantino for a while now. So like, why do you put so much violence in your films? He said because it's fun. And they said, but it's unnecessary. And he said, we don't have to go and watch. You wouldn't go to a Metallica concert and ask them to turn the volume down. Sort of that.
There is that,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, you wouldn't. I mean, I don't like Frankie Bell, sorry, but I hear of his jokes, and I think, well, that because they make the papers, you know, you said this about somebody who's disabled, you said this about someone, and I just find I'm really upset for people's behalf, you know, and that's where I find it very difficult to make a sound judgment about
Yes.
them.
It's never an easy line to tread on that one, but I suppose it's like going to a Jim Davison concert and going, oh my God, how rude. Well, did you not realise he was rude before you went?
Some people, I think, put themselves in the way of it. They deliberately.
Well, yes, it's that slightly
of other people.
Mary Whitehouse mentality of watching something in order to be offended by it.
Also, the idea that
But they're doing it. Sorry, they're doing it to defend other people that haven't asked.
The crusading zeal, back to the religious bit again.
but moving away from comedy, the deeper issue of the fact that just being frightened to say anything, to express any view, this is what I'm worried about. How can you have your own opinion without possibly living in fear about expressing it? That's the issue with our human rights, this issue of anonymity. You know, how can you be who you want to be and express things if you express them politely? We were brought up to believe, or I was, that you could go to Hyde Park Corner, you could stand on a sofa, and you could say whatever you wanted to say.
Yes.
Now, we
You're
live
likely
in
to
a
get
world
hit in the
where
head
we're
with an
frightened
axe.
of our own shadow.
Yes.
And somebody got attacked.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah.
I think she was hit with a machete or an axe or something, wasn't she, for saying whatever it was that she was saying at the time. That absolutely is a concern, and people who regard this as cancellation rather than consequence, one of the issues that gets flagged up is the speed at which the boundaries of acceptability change. So something that was considered perfectly okay to say last week is now, by some people at least, considered unacceptable. And how can anyone keep up to date with who's offended by what this week? It's not as if absolutely everybody in a given group stands up and says that is offensive. Some people will, and other people won't be offended by it at all. And so it's very, very difficult to keep up to date. And it does get to the point where a lot of people think, oh, can I say anything without somebody somewhere saying that's wrong, that's offensive?
Gender has been the major one at the moment.
Gender and rights.
Gender-related.
Yeah.
I mean, when the BLM marches were happening, I felt like people were purposely going through every Twitter profile that had ever been created and going back 5 years to find something that had been posted just so they could get a little bit of virtue from it.
Yes.
And look, because James Gunn lost his job at Disney for a little bit because he'd make tweets as a 17-year-old about race. It was just after the riots, and they course, it just feels like everyone goes through and searches for it, purposefully looks for it.
There's been, I can't remember his name, but I don't follow football, so it goes in one brain cell and out the other.
Oh, I know which. I can't remember.
Said something slightly anti-gay when he was about 14.
14, and he lost, and it was a cricket player as well.
Okay.
I think it was a cricket player, and he said something slightly anti-gay in a tweet, and they sort of, immediately on him.
It's not the term at the moment is offence archaeology. You dig into someone's past to say, as you said, 20 years ago you said this. And this is one of the problems, of course, where this differs from the old-fashioned style of witch hunting, is that if you were in a village in the 16th century, who the hell would remember what you said 20 years ago? Whereas nowadays you type something online, it is there potentially forever. And so people can go back 15, 20 plus years digging up something you don't even remember having written in the first place. That's who said this, and it can be used as evidence against you. And that also brings in issues if we're going with a religious motif. Most religions do make a feature of forgiveness. That if somebody has done something wrong and they repent, they do this, they do that, they do the other, you're meant to wipe the slate. But if we're saying, oh, when you were 14, 20 years ago, you cracked a joke, and what 14-year-old doesn't say something pretty bloody awful that they will regret saying later and will change their minds, or especially most of the 14-year-olds I've ever met, they've got no sense of filter. They just go there, comes out their mouth before they can think twice. Are we actually going to condemn 20, 30, 40-year-olds for things they said when they were 12, 13, 14?
Did you see the article? It was quite a left-wing American newspaper, quite left-wing, and it was a bit like one of those Guardian opinions sort of things. And it was a suggestion in the States, or just a mere suggestion that social credit scores should be judged based on internet search history.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, 16-year-old me is going to pay. I've got a problem here.
delete.
That's just sort of like you're saying it for the sake of, let's see what we can get from this bad boy. Like,
yes.
I mean, yeah, that's a bit of a, 5 years ago, you can't really take the, it defeats the point of an education system.
Yeah.
If you can't put your child through it's like when you're 14, by the time you're 21, you've gone through upper school, sixth form, higher education, university. You've been around different people, you've learned from those experiences. And it devalues the whole learning experience. I stole an orange when I was 3 in Tesco. I just picked it up and took it. I was in, but that shouldn't devalue me from getting a job for the rest of my life. Could you imagine that? Imagine that. Going into a job interview and they say, no, sorry, mate, you took a tangerine when you were 3. I'm 48. I'm mortgage.
Yeah, somebody's spying on you.
Yeah, got that.
There is the whole social credit thing. If some of you probably know, but in China, they're operating a system of social credits, whereby when you do certain things that are considered socially desirable, your credit score goes up. And when you do things that are considered a bit naughty, which can be maybe nicking a tangerine, or saying something vaguely rude about the chairman, then your credit score goes down, very, very dramatically down if it's about the German. And if your score drops below a certain margin, you're not allowed to get on a train. You're not allowed to get on a bus because you've got to have a social credit score to use public transport. There's a whole raft of things that you suddenly cannot do because your credit is not up to score. So you get people who go around doing things, I'll pretend to be nice today in order to bump my score up, as if somehow that's going to make some inner core difference.
That's a state-controlled cancel culture.
Absolutely, of the most extreme sort.
Is the scoring system public?
Yes, so you can find out what your score is, and other people can as well.
How much
Yes.
you'll get for anything you do?
Yes, it's a measured factor, so people are informed. If you do this, you'll get 3 points. If you do that, you'll lose 5 points. And
You
so
have
they
to
can,
have that to have the control.
yes, it's Foucault's idea of
Sounds a bit like school because
gold stars on the charts. Yes.
I'm old enough that you only got told the bad things and then you got told the good things.
Find out who becomes the milk monitor. Yeah, it's one of the concerns. It must be hellish for people in China, but of course, one of the concerns is what other world leaders are thinking. Are they looking at China and going, I wonder if we could try that in Spain, in Russia, in Zaire, in wherever? Or are they looking on in horror? Now, you'd hope if they had a scrap of decency, they'd be looking on in horror. But I'm not sure how many world leaders have a scrap of decency. Wouldn't like to gamble on that one. Would we ever see it over here? There are people who would probably see it as a good idea. How to reinforce good behaviour. It's straightforward, old-fashioned Skinnerianism, behaviourism, reinforcement, reward for good behaviour, punishment for bad behaviour. Time will tell. It's a bit of a dystopian future, that one, like an episode of Doctor Who or something. But let's hope they don't roll it out over here. Net democracy is a concept which keys into this indirectly. The argument has been from various different thinkers and philosophers. Jaron Lanier, particularly, he's a spectacularly odd man, but very, very entertaining if you ever get a chance to hear him speak or listen to one of his podcasts. He's a computer genius. He invented all manner of weird and wacky things, but comments a lot on the ethics, the morality, the kind of philosophical issues to do with online activities and so forth.
His name again?
Jaron Lanier. It's an American chap. It's Jaron, and Lanier is Lanier. He is convinced social media is destroying society, which is slightly ironic because he helped create it. But he says, I wished I hadn't now. Yeah, absolutely. He's yeah. One of his concerns is that if we go back, say, 60, 70 years, Western society, British society particularly, or I dare say most societies, were regarded as what's now termed cultures of deference. So you had people to whom you deferred as trustworthy figures. Now that could be the vicar, it could be police officers, it could be politicians, it could be doctors, a variety of people who, not so much because you know them as individuals, but because they have a title, a uniform, a lab coat, or a police uniform, or whatever it may be. Their role in society gave them a due deference, which doesn't mean every single one of them was shining beacons of perfection, clearly not, but generally there was deference for roles. And part of that is deference for expertise. The doctor knows more about medicine than I do. The electrician knows more about electrics than I do, etc. Net democracy is the idea that once social media became a phenomenon, everyone was going online, and because you don't really know who the hell anyone is, they may give a name, but you don't know if it's their real name. They may have a photo on their profile, but you don't know if it's their real photo, or it might be a photo of their cat or their dog, or something random. So you don't really know who anybody is. There's this anonymity that goes on. When you have anonymity, it's hard to have status based on role, because the whole point of status based on role is that you can see that person. You can see that they're wearing a lab coat or a police uniform or a judge's wig or whatever it may be. You know who they are. When you don't know who they are, authority, deference, as it were, becomes diffused. And so you start to have online conversations in which someone who drives buses for a living feels that their understanding of medicine is at least as good as an immunologist with 30 years of training. And obviously, the whole kind of COVID situation and so forth. Now, it's not to say that you can't have insight as an ordinary citizen into certain issues, especially if you've lived with a particular medical condition. You might have quite a lot of insight about that medical condition. But that's not quite the same as saying I am now an authority on all matters medical. And I can go online and I can announce which medicines work and which don't, and which techniques are good and which techniques are bad. Suddenly, Brexit happens and everyone's an expert on international politics. People.
Afghanistan, everyone became Alexander the Great. I can lead in the military operation. I would have done this thing, which you now. You're a postman.
Absolutely. Pick a random issue and suddenly everyone, if it's a controversial issue, everyone knows everything about it. You no longer have that sense of, well, actually, that person over there really does know a lot about this subject, and by comparison, I know naff all about this subject. Therefore, I should defer to their knowledge, their expertise, their understanding. It goes along with the culture of burgeoning mistrust, that increasing numbers of authorities are seen as suspect. So whereas maybe once upon a time, going on things told me by Irish friends, the Catholic Church would have had tremendous, priests, bishops, whatnot, would have had tremendous status in Ireland. So just seeing someone in the collar or the nun's habit or whatever would confer on them automatic status because of all the sex scandals and the maudlin laundries and all those sorts of things that have come as revelations to people who possibly did know what was going on but preferred to pretend they didn't know what was going on. But then it's in the newspapers, it's on television. The status of the Catholic Church has dropped massively in Ireland to the point where some people, which seems quite unfair, but there we go, they see someone in a dog collar, they automatically think certain very uncharitable things about them, which probably 9 times out of 10 are not true. But they kind of make this automatic assumption. By extension, how many people trust politicians? The old joke about how do you know a politician is lying? Their lips move. There is a perception of the kinds of institutions that might once have had an automatic deference and status about them. I'm not saying everybody in the 18th century trusted every politician going, clearly not, but that there was a level of, well, they must know what they're talking about. They must know what they're doing. Whereas nowadays it's almost the dead opposite. They're kind of an automatic distrust. You're in a position of authority, therefore I cannot trust you. And that partly is something we can track back to Michel Foucault in France in the 60s, 70s, 80s, who proposed that there is no such thing as objective truth, or if there is, it's so hard to find, why even bother looking for it. All claims to truth are actually, he said, claims to power, and it's all dodgy power games. So instead of saying this person who knows about the law, who knows about politics, who knows about economics, who knows about religion is making a statement of truth, we now tend to look at them through this postmodern lens. Even people who've never heard of Foucault and would probably die of boredom if they got through half a chapter. Most people die of boredom if they get through half a chapter of Foucault. Would nonetheless have that kind of attitude floating about them that authority equals suspicion rather than a source of trust.
I'd like to separate the politicians from the other end. I think cynicism about politicians is fair enough. But what worries me is that one article on the internet about microchips in injections seems to count against all the people who've got letters after their names, almost as if the people who have letters after their names must know all each other and then start why is this one article right and all the other ones?
Yes. Bit of a conspiracy going on that they're all in it together. Yes. Absolutely. I've always been somewhat suspicious of conspiracy theories because they seem to assume competence to organise a conspiracy in the first place, and there's not much evidence of that in the world these days. One of the points that both Lanier and a few others make is that it's not so much that we now live in a 21st century culture with no deference, but that we've shifted our deference to a radically different group. So people who wouldn't trust a politician or a bishop or a doctor any further than they could throw them will trust a social media influencer. Some total muppet on the internet who's doing their TikTok dances and pontificating about whatever they're pontificating about will garner more trust because they're seen as anti-establishment than someone who is seen as a member of the establishment. Is there any reason to suppose that someone on TikTok is trustworthy? Not a lot. But yeah. And it's this is Lanier's point. If it's very naive to assume all vicars are lovely, clearly not all of them are, but if that's naive, why is it not equally as naive to assume that all social media influencers know what they're talking about? If we're going to be suspicious that some pharmaceutical companies are corrupt, fair amount of evidence that shenanigans go on, fair enough, you might be very jaded and cynical. Why would you assume everyone waving a bit of lavender and a purple crystal is also somehow trustworthy and has your best interests at heart and knows what they're doing and the rest of it?
I mean, the thing is, my sister said on TikTok that they've got some wonderful recipes in there, and I thought, well, you don't cook. So it's relative to what you know already, isn't it?
Absolutely. Beginning out of a base of ignorance is probably an advantage for something. Yes. No one's been named yet. Oh, well, if I'm found in a shallow grave next week, you know why. So it's kind of goes part and parcel that the feeling that anyone's opinion is as valid as anyone else's, even on complicated matters, goes hand in glove with the sense that this person has said something. I have the authority to know that they're wrong in saying it and to denounce them, and that my voice of denouncement, my finger wagging, should be listened to. So it's a bit like the idea of, if we go back to, say, the 14th century, who defines which religious beliefs are heretical and which religious beliefs are mainstream? In the 14th century, it was essentially the bishops and the cardinals, not Gladys at the end of the village, who would be in charge of deciding what's heretical and what's not.
It's this issue of denouncement that concerns me the most. You think to yourself, here is this marvellous creation, this marvellous technological creation, which is supposed to help us, to benefit us, and actually it's taking us back to primitive levels.
Yes.
Where is the advancement in this?
Well, there is the argument that as much as technology advances, we don't.
No, we don't.
There's primal instincts
Yes.
in us that are not necessarily good, are being played out in a
Yes.
really nasty way.
Absolutely.
But hasn't technology kind of taken over from that? Because when you talk about the social archaeologists, I mean,
Yes.
where do they find the time?
That is a very good point.
All lost years.
Should be writing their essays, not digging into archaeology. No, I suspect there are a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands, and that explains a lot of these problems. We live in strange times, to put it mildly. On the flip side, there are people who regard this as a more positive phenomenon. So Philip Soper makes the argument that the old culture of deference, of doffing your cap to the squire and the vicar and the judiciary and the politicians, was often a very naive thing to do, in assuming that people who might have been as corrupt as hell somehow weren't, and they had your best interests at heart, when probably most of them only had their own interests at heart. So for Soper, it's not necessarily a bad thing that we've got very jaded about people in authority. On the other hand, counterpoint, how can you run a society if nobody trusts each other? Whoever's in charge of a society needs some degree of trust that they know what they're doing.
It's interesting that was 2002. I think an awful lot's happened in intervening. I mean,
Yes.
I think a lot of people around the table would have agreed at that point that we needed to maybe knock down a few people who were hiding behind their position of authority. But who'd have thought we'd be sitting around and it would have switched so dramatically in such a short period of time?
It's I expect it's this tendency to go over the top with everything, like the denouncements. We just, whatever we do it to such an extreme that then we end up thinking maybe we went too far. And there is the danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to any kind of authority system. That yes, there will be corrupt people in any system of authority, but you can't chuck them all out, because then you lose the good ones. And the question then is, what's the ratio between the bad ones and the good ones? Are there more good ones than bad ones, 50-50, 90-10, or what's the ratio in any given institution between the ones who really shouldn't be there and the ones who are doing a pretty damn good job, whatever kind of an institution it may be? Perhaps we've got overly cynical, we just assume everyone's corrupt and we kind of tar everyone with the same brush of dodginess, and then we start denouncing and whacking the finger and you know, wanting something done about it. There is a concern, and SOPA does flag this up as well, so it's not an absolutely glowing recommendation of cynicism, that power exists, authority exists, and if you take it away from one person, the authority just doesn't evaporate. It goes somewhere else instead. It would be like Animal Farm. It just shifts from the farmer to Napoleon, you know, from the humans to the pigs. It goes to somebody somewhere. And if it's not in the system that was governing for 100 years, 1,000 years, however long it was in situ for, who has got that power now? And sometimes the power, a bit like net democracy, diffuses into the mob. And that is a concern because people get a taste for power. So if I can succeed through a few emails in getting some random person I've never met fired, that I now have power. I have succeeded in ending someone's career. Will I then want to do it again? And again and again, and suddenly I'm getting a real appetite for flexing my internet biceps and changing maybe in my own mind I think I'm doing it for the greater good of humanity. But what's really happening is that I'm just enjoying my own command over other people's lives. If you don't say what I think you should say, think what I think I want you to think, I'll get rid of you. And now I've worked out how to do it. And am I going to be somehow more trustworthy than whoever used to be an authority 10 years ago? If it's me, no. Absolutely not. There's not many people you could safely trust with that level of power to cashier in other people's jobs, let alone harangue their families and do other things as well that we've kind of touched a little bit on as we've gone along.
Because people don't have power over their own lives.
Yes. So it's the thrill of having power over somebody else's.
And the anonymity as well.
Absolutely. Because if nobody knows it's you.
And I'm sure that a lot of people who do this feel that they're doing it for the better good.
Yes.
There's a lot of, and I think something that you said was something about virtue signalling, saying, look, aren't I good? You know, that person's bad, but you join me because I'm a good person.
Yes.
And might polish my halo, sort of thing, isn't there? There's a lot
Absolutely.
of that, and that comes back again to the sort of the religious idea of being virtuous.
Yes, buying your way into heaven by sacrificing the sinners.
Yeah.
One author said apparently, people aren't necessarily bad; they're just
stupid. Yes.
And there is something in like lack of education. That's sort of more high ground.
Oh no. Well, that's Bonhoeffer's point was, yes. Yeah. Stupidity unites people together in a way that few other things do. Lee Siegel is a journalist rather than a philosopher or ethicist, but you can be both at the same time, but mainly known as a journalist. He makes the argument that the impact of the internet has been quite negative. Not everyone would agree with him. Some people would say there's good bits, bad bits, but he feels that the bad bits outweigh the good bits. So he's having a bit of a downer on the internet, and it gives a great big long list of problems with the internet. Just to give you a couple of examples of things that he mentions. One is the increase in narcissism, which from a psychological background I find interesting, and I don't think there's been any research projects into this, and I wish somebody would, because I'd like to know what the answer is. Because the question is a bit of a chicken and egg question. there are undoubtedly a lot of narcissistic people online on social media. Now the question is, before social media was invented, were there equal percentages of very narcissistic people around? And nowadays they've just got a yet another platform to shout their egos from. Or is there something about the very nature of social media that turns people who could have been quite ordinary, quite nice, into raging narcissists? So is it a mutating influence, or does it just bring out what's already there anyway? Now, the reassuring answer would be it just brings out what's already there. Because we could go, oh, well, you know, it's just another technology. There's always been idiots. Now they've just got somewhere to shout from. The more worrying answer would be that the technology actually changes people and turns people narcissistic who would not have been narcissistic otherwise. Because that gets quite disturbing if you think about the implications of that. And the percentage of the planet that are online is phenomenally high. People in the Amazon and the Kalahari Desert can get online. It's a global technology. It's not just the luxurious West. It's everywhere. And you get people in places where they can't afford much of anything who still somehow managed to gain access to an online route, a phone, a laptop or something to access social media and other services.
I was reading, I can't remember who was saying it, but it was neuroscientists saying how technology, the constant ability to be able to refer to your phone all the time and have it there and check is causing ADHD in children.
I think that might have been Sacha Baron Cohen's brother, whose first name Lawrence or something like that. I can't remember what his first name is, but he's a Baron Cohen anyway.
Now, I know a particular child who is being having a consultation on it, but I just want to say to her, put your phone brought to me without your phone. It's just the way it is.
Lanier makes the argument that the social media is intentionally designed to reinforce. So the reason phones ping, it's like Pavlov's dogs. It's intentionally done to immediately draw your attention to the screen and condition you, and to want likes and so on.
Did you see the Netflix documentary? It was just called The Social Network.
I haven't, but I have heard about it.
Really
they openly said you get a ping, and it will say people you might know, because you won't know them at all. You won't even, someone might even care, but you've still looked at your phone and you've gone on the phone to get rid of the notification.
Yes.
And I love all the Facebook whistleblowers who come out and say, yes, it's inherently evil, but I built it. Now I denounce it. I could have done something, but I didn't.
Made my millions.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There has been some studies done showing, what was it? Serotonin levels in the brain increase when you get a ping. It's the noise. It triggers a very, very minor serotonin peak, which is the chemical in your brain associated with feeling happy and chilled and reassured. So there is it's as a chemical, it's quite addictive. It's associated with drug addiction. Various drugs release and flood the brain with serotonin, and we do end up craving our own natural levels of serotonin. So it's chasing the high, very, very minor way, but there is evidence that there are definitely medical phenomena happening, biological phenomena happening within the brain in response to the way social media works, and things like the noises and so on that have this impact on adults as well as on kids. The distance issue he flags up, that I could sit here and send a really, really rude message to someone in New Zealand. I don't know anyone in New Zealand, but I could do. And if that person bursts into tears or slits their wrists or does something, I won't know. And because I don't know, I don't care. So you could equally say I could send a really lovely message and I won't know that they're smiling. It goes both ways. But I can be vile without seeing the consequences of my vileness. I might hear about it later on in the news or something, but by the time that happens, I'll stop caring anyway. So particularly, you could argue, I'm a bit stereotypical perhaps, but you could argue that the younger generations who haven't quite had the life experience to weigh up the consequences of behaviour, maybe it's a lot easier if you're 13 to send a vile message to another 13-year-old than if you're 45 to send a vile message to another 45-year-old. Well, you'd hope. Because at least at 45 you've had more life experience than the 13-year-old has. So it's that sort of I don't see it, therefore I don't think about it. Emmanuel Levinas was a Lithuanian by birth, but lived most of his life in France. He's labelled as a French philosopher rather than a Lithuanian one. He makes the argument that all human morality begins and is cradled in what he refers to, because he wrote in French, as the tête-à-tête, the head-to-head. You meet another person, you sit face-to-face with them, which we've done for most of human history. You want to talk to somebody, well, you've got to be in the same room as them. You know, telephones and whatnot are a very recent invention, and the ability to read and write has been confined to a minuscule percentage of the human race for most of our history. Mass literacy is a very, very, very recent thing. So for the majority of history, if you wanted to communicate with somebody, you had to be sitting with them. So if you said something vile to them and they burst into tears, you'd see it. If you said something, I'm sure we've all had messages where you can't work out if they're being funny or they're being rude, unless they put 300 emojis in it, and even then sometimes you think, well, what the hell does that emoji mean? It's like deciphering hieroglyphs. But at least if you're with someone, you can tell, even if you don't necessarily find their joke, going back to Dave Chappelle, you might not find it very humorous, but you can tell from the look on their face that they're trying to be funny. Whether they're succeeding or not is another point, but they're trying. And that would help put it into context, that this person is not trying to upset me, they're trying to be funny. But that's the tête-à-tête. You only get that when someone. That's why we have emojis, because people pretty quickly realised a written message is very, very ambiguous, especially given the low standards of literacy vast majority of internet users have in the first place. That they've written things in a perhaps not very clear way, and how other people then interpret what's been written could be totally at odds with what was in their mind when they wrote it. People take offence over something that was never meant to be offensive. Or maybe they laugh their socks off over something that actually was meant to be offensive, but has fallen short because the person thought, oh, this must be a joke, surely. Misunderstandings are commonplace. Levinas's point is that if you see you upset someone, you pretty soon stop doing it. Unless you're a real hardened sadist and you really, really like upsetting people. Most people, and Levinas's point is that the vast majority of the human race are basically quite decent. It's only a minuscule number of us that are psychopaths. Most people are decent. So most people, if they realise they say something to another person and they're in tears, will stop saying it. They'll want to retract what they've said, or so to be nice to that person. Very few people are that brutal that they can just go, I couldn't care less if you're upset, so what, and stomp on in their size 9 boots. So it's, for him, that's where morality comes from having direct contact. And his concern, although he died before the internet became quite the thing it is nowadays, his concern was that things like telephone calls and the early days of the internet and so on, you didn't really have the human connection. And if more and more of our contact with other living people are kind of mediated through a screen, so we're never actually in the same room as that person, are you going to lose your humanity? Are you going to lose the lived reality of this is another human being who laughs and cries and smiles and scowls and the rest of it? If you grow, I mean, most of us are old enough to remember life before the internet. But imagine someone who's too young to have ever had pre-internet experience. I say all of their friends, a large chunk of their friends will always have been virtual. Are they going to have the same quality of lived human experience that for Levinas creates this human decency through the face-to-face? If you see less and less, especially if you're thinking COVID and lockdown and all of that palaver, you're seeing less and less of other human beings, more and more interaction with imaginary people online. Do you lose your capacity to be decent to them, to understand that they get upset? Absolutely, and that's the kind of the other side of consequence culture, where you don't see the consequence of what you're saying to them because you're never in the same room as them. And maybe what we need is more. I can't stand video links; they get on my nerves. But what we need is more face-to-face contact rather than screen-to-screen contact. Absolutely. For Levinas, you only get empathy for humanity. Absolutely.
Pretty much the difference in my children from lockdown from learning at home to now being back at school. So it's taken them that long time now to get back into that school environment and being around friends and how to act around friends now. Because they've had nearly 2 years down in their education. So it's definitely,
it's a lot of catching up. Yeah. Quite a few schools, especially primary schools, have been reporting low social skills, like kids who used to know how to tie their shoelaces suddenly don't, and used to play nicely now don't, and kind of things. So skills are lost very quickly at that age, at any rate. Maybe not so much older kids, but certainly at that age. He goes on to talk about this idea of affiliator, but we'll get to that in a second. Anonymity is a significant factor, and it's argued that this, or by people like Lanier, that this may be a major issue, in that if nobody knows who you are, you can give yourself a funny name, use a fake photo, you can go online, I could pretend to be a 90-year-old Chinese lady or something and go online. Who's going to know I'm not? If nobody knows who I really am, does that then take the gloves off? Do I suddenly start doing things, saying things that I would not say or do if it was trackable back to me? Yes. Now, whether that would make a nice person suddenly get horrible, or it would make someone who is privately not very nice become publicly not very nice, we're back to this issue. Does it just bring out what's already there, or does it actually start changing people? You suddenly think, oh, I could say this and no one's going to know it's me. Which is that you can argue the whole success of internet porn. It gives you the illusion you can go on. So instead of going into a newsagent's and buying a magazine over the counter, you can go online and look at anything within 3 clicks of a button and feel it's an illusion because anyone can be tracked, but it gives the fantasy. Nobody knows I'm doing this. Whether it's looking at porn, saying vile things to people, shopping sites, dodgy political sites, whatever, it gives you the illusion that nobody knows you're doing it. They could do it if they wanted to, but you have the illusion that they don't. So are you more likely to start branching out and doing? And Freud would argue that we all have a dark side. We all have the occasional urge to look into weird stuff and think weird stuff and do weird stuff. But most of the time we bottle it up for fear of consequence. What will mummy say? What will the neighbours say? What will, they're giving an example. Well, I shouldn't laugh, but it does make me laugh. Hopefully most people have heard of Mary Beard, or at least seen her on TV. If anyone hasn't, I think she's retired now, but she was the classics professor at Cambridge, specialised in Greek and Roman classics. And I've never met her, but she looks like a really nice person. She comes across on TV as a genuine. I know not everyone on TV, some of them turn out not to be very nice, but she comes across as a genuinely nice person. I have a screenshot somewhere in some other presentation of some internet posts that some chap, about 22, 23, something like that, he would have been, posted today. She'd done some TV show about the Romans. And he came back. I won't give you the full colourful language, but it was referring to various parts of her anatomy. And it seemed to be, to me, completely, it started off with him saying, I don't agree with what you said on last night's programme. Within about 3 posts, it had got quite graphic. Yeah. And then the funny bit, well, for me, the funny bit, is that somebody else then went on posted on the same message on this web board saying, "I know his mother." And within about 3 seconds, he was on there going, "Oh, don't tell my mum, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean it." And he sort of reverted to a 12-year-old. I don't know if the person genuinely did know who his mother was, but you know. So suddenly.
Should write that anyway,
Consequence culture in action there.
Yeah.
And he got all apologetic. So I didn't mean it. I shouldn't have said it. Which he shouldn't have done. But you know, just the thought of this bloke going, "Oh no, don't tell my mum."
Just like teenagers, isn't it? When they're at home, they act in one way, and when they're out, they act in another.
Absolutely.
Mum's not watching, so I can do what I want. So it's basically the same as that.
Sorry, Robin, I think it's an issue about accountability as well.
Yes.
You know, because depending on, you know, in a lot of cases, if somebody posts, sorry, just for the benefit of everybody, I'm a former police officer, so, and I used to deal with a lot of internet-based criminality. So, you know, depending on a message or a post that somebody might make, if it is abusive, threatening, it probably constitutes a criminal offence. But you know, in terms of whether that actually gets dealt with, depends on where the victim is, where the person posts it is, what the legislation is, perhaps in that particular country. So there's all sorts of factors about whether something gets dealt with seriously. So, for example, one time we dealt with a guy who sent a message to somebody involved in the Australian cricket team to say, "I'm going to come along and bomb your next match that you play against England." That's quite a serious threat, clearly. You know, it turns out the individual probably had some mental health issues, would never have had the capacity to do that, but clearly you can't have people messaging whether they have got the capability to do it or not. That's got to be investigated, looked at. He probably thought he was anonymous there. Like I say, there was all sorts of social domestic issues going on in the background, but ultimately he got a knock on the door. We took him into custody for a couple of hours, and you know, the threat was basically neutralised. But if that message had come from Bulgaria, for argument's sake, I'll just pull that country out of the fresh air. But you know, undoubtedly you can get online there. If we were to say to the Bulgarian authorities, "Okay, somebody sent this message," I might be being unfair to them, but I guess probably the response wouldn't be that significant, you know, because generally speaking, if you make a request to another country's law enforcement to do something for you, you've got to be dealing with the most serious of offences. So, you know, murder, kidnap, etc., etc. Otherwise, they're pretty busy, you know, as it stands anyway. So, you know, if there's 4,000 requests in the pile, the email about the cricket in England is probably not going to get an amazing response, unless it was in Australia, when obviously they take it fairly seriously as well. But,
They like their cricket.
So, in terms of accountability, people are accountable. They probably are breaking the law in a lot of circumstances, but they're probably going to get away with it. A, because it might not be reported. B, the social media company might have dealt with it anyway. Or C, just because of these various geographic and legal factors, then it might not actually get dealt with. But it doesn't mean to say that in the vast majority of cases, people, you know, are not committing offences. And I think there was a guy prosecuted the other day in relation to some of the racist abuse that had gone on after the European Cup final. I think that was down in Essex or somewhere. So people do get prosecuted for this stuff. You know, they might not get the highest penalties in the world, but you know, when it is serious enough, when the legislation allows law enforcement to do something about it, then you know it will be taken forward. And I think there's a perception that, you know, people are anonymous, and if, you know, they pretty much say what they want and get away with it, well, that's not quite the case.
An interesting insight, but it also shows how much in the way of resources we're using, valuable police resources, to deal with yet another monster that we have created ourselves.
Yeah, just, yeah.
No, but I was thinking on the other hand, is that what people are doing when they're banding together to bring somebody down? They think that society is not going to hold people to account,
So they
are the people who must bring the people to account, because there isn't the facilities, the money to do that, and so they're going to be the vigilantes to enforce it.
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on the nature of the messaging, I think, you know. So there's nothing wrong with saying, well, there isn't a, I think so-and-so should lose their job because I think they're a misogynist, a racist, or whatever. Okay, you can express an opinion, but, you know, if you were to make that message a little more colourful, a little more threatening, a little more offensive, well, then it would probably cross the threshold into something that most people would consider unacceptable and probably would be illegal to boot as well.
There's certainly been a fair amount of that. Going back to J.K. Rowling, she one of the ones she posted online was somebody threatening to send a pipe bomb in the post, which I don't know which country the person was in, but again, probably they never would, just hot air. But as you say, how far do you go from saying I don't agree with your points of view to I want to blow you up? It's a short trip. The other side of this, just briefly, is obviously we are incredibly lucky in Britain in that we have a level of freedom of speech almost unheard of for most of human history. You'd have to go back to tiny villages umpty thousand years ago to get a similar level of freedom of speech to say what you want. We are relatively unusual in the world, and that there's plenty of countries around the world that do not have that level of freedom of speech. And there is this concern that whilst on the one hand making people identify themselves might discourage them from saying rude things to Mary Beard or whoever, because they wouldn't want their mothers or fathers or whoever it is to know who they are and what they're saying. The flip side is that if you're in one of those more totalitarian countries and you want to criticize the prime minister, or you belong to the wrong religion, the wrong political party, the wrong this, that, and the other, and you want to post something about that, and they know your name because you are compelled by social media companies in a bid to discourage bullying and the rest of it, that everyone should drop an anonymity and start using their name. There's a lot of people there who potentially might get a knock on the door at 3 a.m. and never be seen again. So whilst on the one hand there is that urge to what do we do to stop people being vile, threatening to blow up cricket matches, calling nice academics grotty names and what have you, if you made them identifiable, that would perhaps discourage a lot of people from mouthing off. But on the other hand, roll that out worldwide and you've got a lot of people who might not live through the night if they were to express their points of view.
I don't want to be too self-satisfied. I mean, if you think about whistleblowing in this country, if you put your name on it, that's
your job gone.
That's you out of a job, not the person you're whistleblowing about.
Indeed. So not absolute freedom of speech. compared comparatively to other places, we're better off. Oscar Wilde, in one of his pithier moments, said something that Carl Jung would echo a few decades later, that if you give someone a mask, then he will tell you the truth. And Jung said something very similar: give somebody a mask and you'll find out who they really are. So give someone anonymity, they think they're hidden, and you'll find out what they're really like deep down. Whilst they can be identified, we tend to behave ourselves. Now, it may be that deep down they're a genuinely lovely person. This isn't to say that everyone given a mask turns into a monster. Some people are genuinely nice. But those people who hide their monstrousness behind a mask of civility, give them a chance to conceal their identity, and you might well find that grimmer side of them coming to the fore. And is that essentially what social media does? Gives us a mask. That whilst you could go online under your own name with your own photograph, it's equally possible to go online under, as I say, any name and any photograph. Pretend to be anyone you like. Does that mean that we therefore are giving we social media companies are giving a green light to anyone who wants to be vile and dodge the consequences, dodge the accountability, or at least imagine they're dodging it. You can't really dodge it for very long. Going back to Levinas, one of the ideas he came up with is the concept of illeaity, which is a made-up French word. What does he mean by his made-up French word? Well, we won't go into the linguistics of French because we'll be here till Christmas. But he is suggesting, quite a religious man, that everyone has a soul, a divine spark, a sort of a spiritual element about them. Or if you want to put it into more secular terms, there is an essence of human decency. Everyone is a person in the most, we're not just numbers, we're people. When you encounter someone in a way that acknowledges the humanity of that person, you are engaging in what he called illeaity. You are seeing the humanity of that person, and they reciprocate by seeing your humanity. So you meet not as random numbers, as mindless faces on the internet. You meet as two human beings. You have your vulnerabilities, they have their vulnerabilities, and through conversation you kind of gauge each other's humanity, and you realise, well, if I say this, do that, they'll get upset. If they say this, do that, I'll get upset. You kind of sense people's vulnerabilities, their weak spots, their strong spots, their honourable side, their grimmer side. And if you are acknowledging their humanity, you value them, is Levinas's argument. You don't want to mangle them. You don't want to leave them a train wreck at the end of the experience of meeting you. You want them to go away walking on cloud 9, feeling recognised. And there is this, I mean, he's not the only philosopher to make this argument. He's the only one to come up with strange French words for it. He's not the only one to make the argument that a hell of a lot of time we encounter people without seeing them as people. You go into a shop, somebody is on the counter, you're in a rush, here's my money, give me my change, right, goodbye. You don't know if that person's having a good day, a bad day, you don't know what their name is, you don't care. You're in a rush, they're just a face doing a service. And how many of our encounters with another human being, they're just a face. That maybe they're sitting next to you on a bus, maybe they're providing, you know, a doctor, a shoe repairer, a salesperson in a shop, whatever they are. They're there, they do something, you get the something and you go. And you don't give a second thought to their humanity, what kind of life they have, what kind of person they have, and they probably equally don't give a second thought to you. You're just a customer, you're just a face to them, as they are just a face to you. And for Levinas, that is to lose humanity. Partly it's to do with the scale of living. We live in such big communities. If you lived in a tiny little community, you'd know everyone. But because we live in really big communities, people do just become numbers after a while. You can't keep track of who everyone is. There's just too many of them, basically. But once you lose that sight of humans, and this is Durkheim was talking about the problem of bureaucracy, he said, is that when people start to become numbers, they cease to be people. A bit like Stalin's infamous quote, one murder, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths, that's a statistic. It loses its meaning. What do a million corpses look like? I've no idea. Never seen a million corpses. I can't even begin to imagine what a million dead bodies would look like, let alone smell like. It's beyond my, I imagine it's beyond almost everyone's comprehension. Even Stalin probably couldn't imagine what a million corpses in one place would actually look like. And so when you're operating at that level, you make a decision and one of your minions says, oh, but Mr. Stalin, 50,000 Russian peasants will starve to death as a result of your policy. 50,000? What's 50,000? It's a number. You're not seeing them starve. You're not hearing them crying with hunger. You don't have to walk over the bodies. It's a number. And you've lost their humanity. You don't have that illeaity. And whilst obviously Stalin driving umpty-million people to death in Russia is a world apart from people being a bit rude to each other online, you can argue nonetheless, if you're being vile to someone, it's because you've got no sense of their humanity. And even if whether you're being vile just because you're a snotty 16-year-old who likes being vile to people at random, or because they've said something and you don't agree with it, and you come back and you lambast them and call them every name you can think of for having the wrong point of view, you're still not seeing them as a human being. You're not engaging with them as a human being. So you can disagree with somebody's points of view and still treat them as a human being. Illeality doesn't mean you approve of everything they say and do. So you can have a discussion, I think you're wrong about this issue, without ripping their face off in the process.
That's what it used to be about, didn't it?
Should be.
We've lost it, I think.
But for him, this is all back down to that kind of tete-a-tete, that seeing another human being in the flesh.
Does it come back to this sort of idea of the tribe, that we can cope with about 150 people, and beyond that, the whole thing just gets out of control?
Yes. It is a numbers game, essentially, which, given the size of communities these days, I don't think there's much of anything we can really do realistically. The BIHIs have recommended everyone should live in communities of 450, and when there's a 451st, someone moves, starts a new community somewhere else. I don't know how manageable that is, but nice thought if you can do it. But you don't have to be religious to go with this idea of basic core of humanity. He frames it in the language of soul and spirit and so on. But you can have a secular version of the same thing, and have that sense that, do you see that person as a human being? You know, look at the way that people talk to each other on Facebook and Twitter and all this rubbish. Are they? Well, some of them will undoubtedly engage with each other as humans, but plenty don't, and lose that sort of decency. Eli Pariser makes an argument that part of the problem is the very nature of how algorithms work. All sites, like things like Twitter, Facebook, the rest of it, operate by computer. Whilst there are some little people in offices who can look at what you're typing if words flag up, you know, associated with terrorism and things like that, there are human beings who can go, oh, look what she said. But by and large, these systems are operated by computers, not by human beings. And computers operate on the basis of algorithms. So if you go onto YouTube and you type in, I don't know, curry recipes, the next time you go onto YouTube, you'll find 35 different websites to do with curry recipes flagging up. Not because it wants you to like curry, it couldn't care less. It's a computer, it doesn't know what a curry is. But it's noted you've put in certain keywords, and it will now bombard you with those keywords till you're blue in the face. So if you put in left-wing opinions, left-wing politicians, whatever, you'll get 50,000 left-wing sites. If you put in right-wing, you'll get 50,000 right-wing sites. So it's just an echo chamber is the constant repetition of the same thing back to you. You express an opinion and then you hear it back 100-fold. Partly it's to do with things like recommended sites appearing for you on things like YouTube, but it's also the sense, Parazio is talking about, that if I go on Facebook and I say, well, I really can't stand so-and-so politician, and somebody else I know goes, oh, but I love them, they're wonderful. Will I say, oh, that's interesting, let's have a heated debate? Or will I go, you moron, I'm going to cancel you and unfriend you, how very dare you like some politician I don't like, and I delete them as a friend, and that's one less person with a different point of view that I then have to listen to. And will it get to the point where the only people left, like an Agatha Christie, where the bodies are dropping left, right and centre, the only people left for me to listen to are the people who think exactly what I think? So I create, as well as the algorithms creating an echo chamber, I create my own echo chamber. If I am the kind of person who will eliminate anyone whose points of view I don't want to hear, I don't like, I don't agree with, etc. If you get to that point in time, one of the arguments that Pariser flags up is, do you lose the capacity to cope with disagreement? Life for the last 100,000 years has been learning to cope with the fact that other people think differently, like different things, dislike different things, and you just kind of got to get on with them, more or less, most of the time. But if you eliminate all difference, and let's say for 5 years you haven't heard a different point of view, after 5 years of just hearing your own opinions echoed back to you, do you get to the point where you no longer know how to listen to a different point of view? And so if somebody sitting next to you on the bus starts spouting a different point of view, you can't just press a button and get rid of them. Suddenly you freak. And you've lost the social skills needed to cope with disagreement. So rather than saying, well, I don't agree with you, but let's be friends, let's go our own ways, you go ballistic. And that's the concern. The overreaction is partly down to the lack of social skills to know how. And you could argue, Veblen, if he'd lived long enough, would have argued this as well, because he was convinced that technology drives society. An invention comes along and then it makes us do things. We react accordingly. So the people in offices in Silicon Valley who are designing Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it, they designed it in such a way that you can get rid of people whose opinions you don't like, who you want to unfriend. And having given us this ability, I suppose if nobody had ever used it, probably after a while they'd have stopped providing it. So maybe it's a kind of half at 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. But they gave us it as a capacity. And so many people use it that they keep providing it. And it's an odd realm to live in. Because you can't, if you're a kid in a classroom with 30 other kids and you don't like some of the, you can avoid them, but you can't just delete them. You can't get rid of them. You're still going to hear their voice, even if you wished you didn't have to. In a real life situation, you don't have the opportunity to press a button and vanish someone. But
the real concern is that when you hear about universities actually facilitating that.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that I find is one of the most scariest things. I mean, that, probably all of us around the same. The idea is that you debate, that you have a discussion, you learn from other people, but to stop that is just
dangerous.
Dangerous. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's becoming as well, maybe not quite as popular here as in America, but it is becoming a phenomenon here. Deplatforming. It's concerning, to put it mildly. And you could make the argument that deplatforming someone is a bit like defriending them or unfriending them, rather. It's kind of an extension of the same mental process. And we're expecting real life to start providing us with the things that virtual life provides us with. So, and again, you could argue younger generations who've not had the previous experience might be more susceptible because they haven't had to live through things prior to internet opportunities to get rid of people you don't want to hear.
Now, I was just going to say, Hugh Dennis said he bought a ladder, and then from then on he was bombarded with adverts for ladders. The last thing he wanted was a ladder because he just bought one. Why didn't the algorithm understand it? And I'm just wondering, I mean, the algorithm is terribly young. I wonder whether it can be influenced.
Oh, I'm sure they can be changed and adapted if the companies want to change them.
Commercial benefit to the providers, because
I can't imagine ladder companies make much money after the first one is sold.
It was me and much conversation. It will remind me later things that I said by sending an advert for something.
Yeah.
But perhaps he kept talking about it, you got it so.
Alexa was spying on him.
Yeah.
Well, people have tried that. Just adverts for that.
It's disturbing the amount of surveillance and monitoring that goes on, to put it mildly. I'll skip them. Okay. That's a rather waffly quote. I'll read it for you from Catherine Cross, who's a sociologist. People believe in the idea that anonymity is central to what motivates harassment, that it is the distinctive feature of the online world that makes it such a toxic place. But anonymity does not cause harassment. It does play a role, but it is much more complicated than most people make it out to be. If we continue down this path of blaming anonymity, we will never tackle the causes of online harassment. Which is in terms of what we do about this problem, there's a lot of people say, well, if people are going online anonymously and saying vile things, the solution is to take away their capacity to go online anonymously.
It's a tool, isn't it?
Yes. So will people be just as vile if they can put their name to things or have to put their name to things? And she's suggesting, well, actually a lot of people, some people would stop, but a lot of people would be just as vile, even if they had to put their own name and their own photo and kind of take ownership of what they're saying. Because, and perhaps it's kind of a bit like the sort of Bulgarian situation you're describing, the sheer volume of people being vile online cannot be policed. There are not enough police officers in the world to keep track of everyone who's being vile online. And so even if you've got to put your name on it, the chances of anyone actually doing anything to you as a follow-up are quite low. So that's her argument. It wouldn't really solve anything to take away anonymity and force people to have ownership. Part of her issue is that shorter quote there, that there is no accountability for bad behaviour on the net. Well, there's starting to be accountability, but at a very hit and miss level. And you could certainly make the argument that what we're looking at is vigilante mobs, who say, well, the police can't do anything about this, so we're going to do something about it, and we're going to take charge, and we're going to go and lynch that person for having said this thing. One of the issues there is that it takes it out of any kind of regulation. The trouble with big trouble with vigilante mobs is that they never know when to stop, and that's why it's preferable not to have too many of them in any given context. Is that they very rarely draw a line and say, right, we're done now, let's calm down and go and have a cup of tea. They sort of just kind of go on and on and on, and then or attack the wrong person. There have been a few paedophile cases where they've gone and killed somebody who had the same surname. And those sorts of problems kicked in. So the awkwardness of vigilante mobs is the whole thing in itself. Yes, there was a case. It was in Wales, somewhere like that, of people who. Yeah, I think so.
I don't know. He actually had it on a brass plate, pediatrician. As if you'd advertised that you were a paedophile.
On a brass plate. It's a very posh paedophile. They have it on a brass plate. Cross's other argument is, and she's talking about the kind of targeting of celebrities. Obviously, not all cancellation is directed at celebrities. Some of it is directed at quite ordinary, everyday people who are being got at for some issue. But she's saying, particularly when it comes to celebrities, and then by extension, that starts to ripple out to ordinary citizens. If you're either online or watching the telly or looking in a glossy magazine or something, and you see a celebrity, part of you knows quite clearly that they're a human being. That they may be mega famous and rich, but they have the same bodily functions as everybody else. They're just a human being at the end of the day. But part of us has got into the habit of treating them almost like kind of gods or saints or something, that they're somehow not quite human, that they're so distant that they lack humanity. Partly, she says, it's to do with this idea that if you're watching Question Time or football or something and you're effing and blinding at the screen, they can't hear you. You can be as vile to people at a screen as you like. And do we start carrying that mentality over to this type of screen? So yes, we're typing a message to them and we sort of expect them to read it, otherwise what's the point of typing it? But have we got so used to shouting at a TV screen and them not being impacted by us shouting at them, that we somehow think that even when we're being vile directly to them, they won't be hurt by it? That they're too famous, too rich, too this, too that, to get upset by me calling them every name under the sun or whatever I'm going to do. So their celebrities are kind of almost taken out of the common herd of humanity and seen as somehow different. And if we get used to doing that with actors and singers and politicians and footballers and whatnot, do we then start doing it with just everybody online, that somehow they just become not quite real? And we're back to Levinas's point that if you don't really know them, somehow they're just a name. They're not really real in any meaningful sense. And so you don't think about them having a bad day, getting sad, getting it. Even when there's cases of celebrities who do go and commit suicide and do things like that because of harassment campaigns and that sort of thing. And there's a 5-minute furore on social media, people go posting "be kind" memes, and in the next breath being an absolute swine to everyone around them. Yeah, let's care about mental health for a day, and then go back to being foul to one another and haranguing people. it's prone to this sort of spottiness. The Gay Emission makes this, who's a journalist, makes this argument that if you are as rich as J.K. Rowling or Dave Chappelle or one of those sorts of people, and you get cancelled, and maybe you get deplatformed from talking at a university, or some TV channel drops your show, if you're that loaded, you can sit in your Rolls Royce and cry all the way to the bank and bounce back. So she's not bothered by the idea of the rich and famous being harangued, perhaps not seeing the kind of humanity of them there to some extent. And to a point, she's kind of right in that people at that level of finance can survive cancellation quite easily. It's not going to have the same effect on them it would have on a primary school teacher who's pushed out of their job. But they're still a human being, no matter how rich, how famous they are. They can still suffer emotionally. And she doesn't give an awful lot of thought to what happens when it's not the rich and famous being cancelled. It's a teacher, a shop worker, a garage mechanic, or whatever they are, who's being driven out of a job because they've said something, done something, and somebody somewhere doesn't like it, and random strangers are cracking down on them. So it's a bit of a, to me, it seems a bit of a dismissive attitude. Oh, you're rich, who cares? Well,
it's not to do with money.
No.
It's to do with the person.
Losing their humanity again.
Mm-hmm.
They're just a walking bank account. They're not a human being. And that can be, especially if we think of maybe some of the more colourful characters, Donald Trump. It's very easy to forget that there is a human being somewhere under all of that orange skin dye. There is actually a human being. Does he care about most people's opinions? Probably not. But even at that level of celebrity, they are still human beings. Ooh, jumping around all over the place. Flavia Zoden, who is a media influencer, or a name on social media, she critiques this idea of calling people out, which is a buzzword that did the rounds for a while, well, still does do the rounds, really. Calling people out is when you denounce someone. You say, well, so-and-so said this or did this, and I think it's awful. And you go online and you leave your denouncement of them on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, whatever it is that you're going to leave your denouncement on. For her, she's not objecting per se to holding people accountable at all, but what she is objecting to is the online element of it. Because for her, it's more about virtue signaling, going back to your other points, that look at me, I'm denouncing that awful person, I must be saintly by contrast. I don't think that, I don't have those racist, sexist, whateverist points of view, I'm a smashing lovely person, unlike that muppet over there that I'm pointing the finger at. So it's all about looking good rather than doing good. Not everyone would agree with her, but she's got quite strong points of view on that. And she sees it as borderline harassment and bullying. That yes, that person may have a few dodgy views, but does that give you the right to hound them and make their life a misery because they're out of date in their point of view about some issue or another? Maybe, she says, there are much better ways. So she uses the phrase calling in rather than calling out. Calling in is what we used to call having a quiet word with somebody. So you take them to one side and say, look, that joke you told yesterday, or whatever, a bit iffy. Maybe you need to reconsider. I think you upset Mary in the office or whatever. So you do it privately. Yeah. Yes. No one knows you've done it. There's no hoo-ha. There's no public shaming and denouncement. They don't have to walk around with a big letter stitched on the front of their shirt or blouse or whatever. And she says it's more effective. Most people, if somebody says to them quietly, I think you've upset somebody, or I was a bit hurt by what you said yesterday, most people will react and say, I didn't mean to hurt you, etc. Some people will get shirty, but most people won't. And so if your aim is to change that person's opinions, that's a much more effective way of doing it than a big public showing and pointing the finger process. The whole bit about performativity, well, we could be here back to Christmas talking about that. Judith Butler, who is an American sociologist renowned for inability to say in 3 words what she can say in 46,000 words, has come up with this term performativity. Mostly she's talking in the context of gender, which is her big subject she writes a lot about, but it applies in lots of other areas too. Performativity is when you act out a role. You are seen to behave in a certain way. So, in most businesses, you have to be seen to behave professionally. Whatever you think privately, personally, go home and say to the dog when no one else is listening is one thing, but you must be seen to perform. In the context of gender, you dress a certain way and you look feminine, you dress a different way, you look masculine. It's this idea of how you walk, how you dress. It's a performance. And she says a lot of life is quite like a stage act. But sometimes you've played a role for so long, it's hard to take it off anymore, and you forget it's an act. In this context that Zoden is talking about, the anti-virtuous bit, anti-moral, oh, look at me standing up for the oppressed, becomes an act. And it's all about performing and getting the applause of the crowd, rather than actually making the world a better place, actually doing any good, actually asking the group you think is oppressed if they think they're oppressed. That's where we kind of branch off into Marxist areas and his arguments around false consciousness, which is when Karl Marx went along to lots of poor people and said, "You're oppressed," and they went, "No, we're not." He said, "Yes, you are." "No, we're not." And that continued like a Benny Hill sketch for about half an hour. And he went away going, "You've got false consciousness because you're too stupid to realise how oppressed you are. Only I am clever enough to know how oppressed you are." There's an awful lot of social media which is essentially one person saying to everyone else, "You're oppressed." "No, I'm not." And it goes on like that. So Zoden's point is you shouldn't get involved if the people in question about whom the joke is told or to whom the comment is directed, if they're okay with it, mind your own bloody business. You don't need to do this white knight, I'm going to charge in and defend people type of act, because it's an act. That's the point. It's all about looking good rather than doing good. And she does make this point that there is a lot of kind of exploitation of grievance that goes on.
That came out a lot for the MP who's recently been stabbed. Everyone put in if you look at the social media comments, it will say, I feel sorry for the guy, but he did vote against gay rights, and it's like, he had 5 kids and he was a Roman Catholic. Like,
what are you going to expect?
He was entitled to his own views. He had 5 children. He's still father at the end of the day. It's just sort of I'm going to look good, and everyone puts a political argument across, and it's like, no, a man was stabbed at the end of the day.
Yes.
Like, it doesn't. You're not going to look good in any way, but it sort of gets in the whole yeah, look at us. To vote against gay marriage, I'm standing up for their rights and that sort of thing. It's like, it's just it gets a bit silly in the end. It's comical,
tacky,
very distasteful.
Durkheim, going back a stretch now, he was fascinated by things like the witch trials and if he'd lived long enough to see the Russian show trials, he'd have probably written a shelf's worth of books just about that alone. But he says that talking about people being deviant and weird and peculiar, there is a functionality to that, in that if someone is seen to be weird and everybody else stands up and goes, "Look at the weirdo," what you're doing is all standing together, all pointing the finger at the weirdo, and that's bonding. So whilst on the one hand Zoden is saying this is a really negative thing, he's not saying this is nice. He's just saying this is actually what happens, like it or lump it. This is how humans work. We band together and burn the witch. And in burning the witch, we come together. So people you might not like otherwise, you suddenly are shoulder to shoulder with. And part of it is also saying, I'm not a witch, she's a witch, I'm not a witch. That's why we're burning her, not me. It's a way of kind of distancing yourself from the sin of the person that you're targeting. So I'm not a racist, they're a racist. I'm not a homophobe, they're a homophobe. And it's a distancing. The even more cynical interpretation is that the more you do it, pointing fingers, everyone looks at that end of the finger. No one looks at this end of the finger. And so it's a way of deflecting from yourself. Don't look at me, look at them. Aren't they awful? Don't read my posts from 15 years ago, read their posts. Terrible, dreadful people, awful, awful people. The measured response element is one of the big areas of concern. And we kind of touched on this quite a lot already. How much is an appropriate response to somebody being unpleasant, or at least unpleasant in your eyes, if not unpleasant in everybody's eyes? So somebody says something that you don't like. Maybe it's something sexist, racist, some otherist. Maybe it's a point of view about religion, about politics, about any subject under the sun that you find dodgy. What is an appropriate measured response next? To say to that person, well, it's a bit dodgy, I don't like what you said, can you stop saying that? Keep it civil, keep it polite. Is it to drive them out of a job? Chuck them on the dole queue, they should never be allowed to do that job again? Does it matter what job they do? So if it's a dustman with dodgy views about race, is that different from a policeman or a school teacher or a civil servant with dodgy views about race? So it's okay to be racist if you're a dustman, because they don't care whose bins they're emptying. But does it become more of a concern if they're in some kind of what we euphemistically call public-facing area of work? If so, do you then go and target their boss? How very dare you employ this person? Or is it more a case of saying, how very dare you not send them on a training course to get them thinking appropriately? Which is ever so slightly Maoist, isn't it? Let's get everyone thinking appropriately. You do not think correctly. You must take steps. Do you hound them? Do you brick their windows? Do you put petrol on an oily rag through their door? People have. It's clearly illegal. But this is the point. When does the mob stop? And the whole problem with mobs is that they never know when to stop. They just go on and on and on until they run out of things to set light to. Whereas if you're going back to the days of witch hunting and whatnot, where it's controlled by an authority, the authority decides who gets the finger pointed at them, what's done about it, and when you've got to stop. So, right, we've burned 3 witches, that's your lot. You have to wait till next month if you want to burn another one. We are done for today. We've had our quota of screaming, ranting, raving, and red hot pokers. It's over with. And there are, thinking of witch trials, there are examples historically where the local church has stepped in. In fact, there was one in Suffolk going back quite a while now, where the church stepped in and rescued someone from being drowned in a pond and said, they're not actually a witch, you do know this, and gave the woman shelter and kept her safe until the mob got fed up beating on the door of the church and went home. So it's not all about the vicar denouncing the witch and burning her, which is the stereotypical image. Sometimes it goes the other way around. But an authority steps in, and the authority has the capacity to say, look, enough is enough, stop. But we're back to this issue that authorities are being questioned. Who is the authority when it comes to some celebrity, some bus driver, some teacher, some whatever, saying something, doing something that is not approved of? And it could be something really genuinely horrible. I mean, we're not just sort of people saying stupid things. Maybe there's a video of somebody kicking 7 shades out their dog or something like that. And you want to do something about it. What is the appropriate step? When do you say enough is enough? This has been dealt with. And that is another problem with the internet, that you may have had the experience where somebody posts up, oh, my so-and-so celebrity has died, and then everyone else says, well, they've been dead about 15 years, actually. And they've only just seen the message, so they post it thinking this person has died yesterday, when they've actually been dead donkey's years. But the nature of social media is that stuff gets recycled. Old stuff is repeated as if it's new stuff. They get announcements about missing children who were missing 12 years ago and have been found. But the person reposting it doesn't realise it's an old message. So it's presented as a brand new thing. And again, so let's say somebody has said something really vile and they've retracted it. But 5 years later, somebody sees the vile message for the very first time. And so they put it up, going, oh my God, look what so-and-so said. And it goes on and it goes on. A possible response to this is to give internet messaging a shelf life, so that after a certain period, companies delete messages. So you can't then troll back through what somebody said 20 years ago. You can't then repeat a missing child thing that's 10 years out of date. It's over, it's done with, it's gone. It could be done, the technology is there to do it, but companies just don't do it. And it's a problem in that vein. I think there's people hovering to come in, so I'll just finish on this bit. One of the big issues here to address, and there's no solution, there's no easy answer to this. If somebody punches you in the face, that is a very clear and obvious harm. You've got a bruise, a broken bone or whatever. That physical harm is easy to define. Emotional harm, mental harm is very difficult to define. It's particularly if we're defining it in a legal context, where there could be legal consequences. Somebody said this, did that, and I feel hurt. I've got no bruises, I've got no broken bones, I've not lost any money, but I feel got at, which you could argue is the basis of hate speech. I feel got at. There's no material evidence I can point to of an injury, but somebody said something vile about my race, my sexuality, my gender, my whatever, and I feel got at. How you evaluate that is like nailing jelly to a wall in a sense. And so the notion of this person has said or done something harmful, if it's a video of them kicking their children up and down stairs, yeah, fair enough, there's obvious material evidence of harm. If it's an issue they said a thing, and I think that thing they said is hurtful, but how do you measure that? And John Stuart Mill's argument, not universally accepted, obviously, but argument was that the government, the law, should, generally speaking, stay out of anything unless there is measurable harm. So, you know, when it came to things like gay rights and relationships, he said, well, what's the harm? Who's hurt by two blokes, two women? As long as the doors are shut, who cares? Which in his lifetime was a pretty radical thing to advance. Likewise about women getting the vote, he said, well, what's the harm? And it's difficult to think, well, I suppose you could elect a really rubbish politician, but then we can all do that. Just about what sex you are, electing rubbish politicians is a worldwide phenomenon. But there's no obvious harm to that one. And so how do you evaluate the harm of a dodgy joke from Dave Chappelle or an iffy tweet from J.K. Rowling or whoever, whatever it may be, if there is no actual physical attack? And identifying harm is one of the big problems with this. I think it's harmful, therefore I'm going to cancel that person. Or somebody else might not think it's harmful at all. And it's the subjectivity of it makes it a really difficult thing to deal with. But before that lady starts kicking the door in.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
If anyone would like one of the slightly updated flyers with seminars and whatnot on them, please do take.
That's all. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes.
Pleasure. Very warm here.
It's really enjoyable. Really enjoyed it.